In case anyone comes across this, this is a book I've written called Child of Earth and Air that I've recorded specifically so my mom can listen to it on an audiobook version. If you happen to find it, I hope you enjoy it. In the beginning, there were three peoples, the children of the air, the children of the sea, and the children of the earth. The children of the air were born with wings and walked among the clouds. They lived long lives, often as much as 9 or 10 centuries, but were few in numbers. They were peaceful people, living lives of beauty and calm. The children of the sea were born with gills and walked along the seabed. They were travelers, hunting and fishing in new homes almost every night. They lived long lives, though not nearly as long as the children of the air, at most 500 years. The children of the earth were born without gills or wings, and they could only walk along the land. They were short-lived and weak, often not surviving more than 50 or 60 years. Though their lives were short and restricted, they were full and spirited, and they were great in numbers. Chapter 1. Professor Reed stopped in front of a large display case and cleared his throat. It was dim in the museum, the light tinged blue where it streamed through the shifting waves outside the almost floor-to-ceiling windows that took up the far wall. The museum had been built into the side of a bluff, and these bottom floors dipped far enough down that even when the tide was low, the glass walls were under water. The marble floors reflected the sunlight that streamed in, but the black stone walls, which allowed the exhibit to stand out, made the halls seem like they were in perpetual dusk. The gas lights that were strung throughout the halls would not be turned on until the sun set. The free institution could hardly afford to run the lights all day, but Professor Reed did wish they would at least turn on the lights over the stone while he was lecturing about it. If he had thought ahead, he would have had Mark bring a handheld lamp. Professor Reed cleared his throat again. And as you can see, the script, because yes, I believe it to be a script, not pictograms as some of my esteemed peers believe, the script in the top section of the stone is clearly unlike any other in current use or found among other relics, and the script at the bottom, if it is a script, is too worn to be identified, but the script in the middle is clearly related to some of our modern system of writing, though of course the language is downright unrecognizable. He cleared his throat and turned to check his students. Most of the students had that mindless, blind look on their faces that told the professor quite clearly they were not absorbing a word he said. This was understandable. After 4 hours walking the museum and listening to lectures on the different exhibits, they had to be tired. Still, he cleared his throat again and continued. This will be on the test, gentlemen, and if you are hoping to be considered for the open research assistant position, I will expect you to be able to understand and explain the nature of even the most obscure exhibits. He looked around, and at least a few students blinked rapidly until their eyes focused. Now, as I was saying, the three-text stone was one of the last pieces pulled from the great city of mirrors before it collapsed into the sea nearly 400 years ago. For some reason, our predecessors thought this ugly piece of rock important enough to save it over countless works of art and architecture, though from references in John the Shipbuilder's letter to the Third Island Institute, we can glean that even then they had no idea what was written on the stone, nor why it would be important. I believe that our greatest chance of translating this stone lies in the center section. Not just the center section, but specifically this phrase here. He reached out, tapping the glass in front of the 6-foot-tall, 3-foot-wide volcanic rock. Grost epsi fornt vrij, he read aloud. Yes, it sounds like nonsense now. But first we must consider that the stone came from mares, and there is a little-known local dialect that was mostly lost with the city, but which was known for combining and separating words in ways unlike we're used to on any of the other surrounding islands. Taking that into account, and the easy commingling and contamination between certain letters, P, T, and F, and we can conceivably come to the phrase Crospin seplorent edna verti. But what does that mean? He nodded absent-mindedly. Grospin seplorent edna verti is a saying common to the island of Nons, a small island off the coast of what was Mers. It means roughly, where the sea meets air, expect waves. Many scholars, myself included up to recently, believe this to be a basic aphorism, meaning nothing more than that the mixing of two disparate elements makes for a release of energy which is rarely without danger, as I'm sure those of you studying chemistry will agree. He paused for the expected and duly granted smattering of laughter. But the locals have long agreed that this saying means more than that. According to local historians, the word verti, which is traditionally translated as waves, has another meaning. They claim a more accurate and original translation of the phrase would be, "Where sea meets air, expect war." This, while a telling indication of the local problem with violent storms, at first seems of little import in relation to the translation of the three text stone. But the word "rye" appears more than a dozen times in the center section of the stone, and if we assume that this is not about tides and the sea as has long been held as true, but instead about war, we begin to recognize many more translatable phrases. Down here, near the lost sections, is a section that says, "Venalib escrate nelifam edna pa teratal." Now, a terata is a kind of old-fashioned battlement that was once employed off the fourth island, and bana is an old island of Nan's word for ceasing of aggressions. I attest if you take this kind of view of the entire stone, we will not just be able to translate it, but that we will find this is in fact an ancient record of some kind of treaty or peace agreement. The professor paused, nodding ecstatically, obviously expecting a response, but his students did not cheer or gasp. They were just blinking blearily at him again. He cleared his throat. "Well then, your assignment for the week is to find 3 words in the center section of the stone that either support or deny this theory. I expect at least a page of argument either way, detailing the etymology and dialectic traits that allow you to make your assertion. I'll even offer 10 points of extra credit to anyone who manages to make even a passable attempt at translating a complete sentence. You are dismissed." The students let out a collective groan, but the professor barely noticed. He was already moving towards a small, half-disguised door at the end of the hall. Most of the students leaned in, already squinting to copy sections of the rough lettering. 2 of the young people shared an amused smile and broke away from the class to follow the professor, who glanced back at them as he fumbled with the keys to his office. "I really don't understand how they can be so disinterested. The three-text stone is a perfect representation of the knowledge that has been lost over the past 1,000 years. Do they have no idea how important this could be? How could we have lost 3 languages completely in under 1,000 years? What do all these relics from mirrors mean, and why were they so important? I can't help but feel that if we can just crack this stone, we will finally find the clues we need to piece together our lost history." He didn't notice Mark behind him sharing an indulgent smile with the young woman. "You know I agree with you, Professor Reed, but this is a general history course. Most of those boys are studying to be chemists, engineers, lawyers, or even doctors. And how does that exempt them from knowing their own history? The foundations of knowledge are built on the past, and choosing to not understand the past—" "That's not what Mark meant, Father." The young woman smiled, softening her tone. "It's just that those students have so much else to worry about. It's hard for them to get excited about a task that they probably see as far above their abilities." The professor nodded reluctantly, while he led his daughter and her fiancé into his office. "I am more than willing to accept that, but while they are in my class they must at least pretend to be interested in my assignments, and that research assistant position would look good on any of their records." Isabella laughed. "But they all know you will be giving the position to, say, someone actually studying history. Probably someone who is studying the lost languages of mirrors. Which means Mark." The young man blushed. He was attractive in a bookish kind of way, with small round glasses perched on his nose under messy golden brown hair, intelligent eyes, and his sleeves constantly stained with smudged ink. He was tall, but stooped from hours of leaning over books, and though he had surprisingly broad shoulders, he was as thin as only someone who forgot to eat on a regular basis could be. He was exactly what a student of historical languages should be, and exactly what the fiancé of a history professor's daughter should be. Professor Reed looked over his glasses at Isabella. She was not at all what a professor's daughter should be. She was beautiful, with striking blue eyes and curly black hair that never seemed willing to stay in any kind of braid or bun. She was dressed fashionably today, in miles of lace and ruffles, all wrapped around a tightly bound frame, but she could far more often be found in hardy wool skirts and men's button-up shirts, and she made even those look stylish. Professor Reed cleared his throat. "I would be more than willing to consider another student, even one studying chemistry, if they would show even the slightest sign of interest. I hardly wish to be accused of nepotism." Mark managed to look even more embarrassed, but Isabella just raised an expressive eyebrow as she propped herself on the edge of her father's desk. "It can hardly be called nepotism when Mark is the only student following the exact field of study you are researching." Professor Reed still looked annoyed. He nodded over to the young man. "Still, I expect exceptional work from you on this assignment, Mark. In fact, you might want to make yourself available for when those fools forget everything I've taught them about etymology and translation. I'll make sure that you get credit for tutoring." The young man nodded and rushed off, leaving the professor and Isabella alone in the dim office. Down a short flight of stairs from the lowest level of the museum, the sun filtering through the deep water was even darker. Professor Reed harumphed and lit the gas lamp set high in the wall. A school-wide memo had gone out less than a week before, asking that no one light lamps in any of the outer rooms until after sunset. But that was absurd. How was he supposed to do his research or prepare for classes when it was too dark to see the page in front of him? Professor Reed had considered requesting an office higher in the bluff years ago, but most of the relics he was studying were on this level, and so he tolerated the darkness. He also tolerated the cramped, chilly, and occasionally damp conditions. The first island museum and university was a marvel of historic and modern engineering, with its huge sheets of hardened glass keeping out the sea, its gas lighting and steam heating running throughout the miles of halls, classrooms, and offices, and its position carved out of the very bluff itself. But the building had some problems, especially in the lower levels. It was never especially warm, even with the steam heating, the sea stealing all the warmth from the marble floors and granite walls. The lower halls, carved an estimated 600 or more years before, were significantly smaller and less finished than those above, but with the lowest levels under water, in any but the most extreme low tides, there was no chance of expansion or major renovations. They also leaked. Not much. Not even one room had been lost to the sea in the 400 years that the university had been in residence. But Professor Reed, like many of his neighbors, kept his bookshelves on the inner walls, and never left anything important on the lower shelves. He had to throw out 3 rugs ruined by the slow seepage, and had a regular string of maintenance workers that trooped through once a week to check his windows and repair the seals. But it was his office. It might not have the fireplaces that some of the upper offices had, but it was right across from the 3-text stone, and Professor Reed cared far more for convenience in his studies than creature comforts. He had his notebooks and a textbook out before the door even closed behind Mark. Isabella sighed, feeling forgotten. "Father, how did it go with Professor Green?" The man barely looked up from his notebooks, murmuring something indistinct. "Father, you were supposed to have talked to the dean today." "Hmm?" "They are making the admissions decisions tonight. They have my school records and my recommendations, but it's going to look very bad for me if you, my own father and the head of the history department, does not at least put in some kind of good word for me." Professor Reed looked up, blinking blearily. "Oh, I'm sure you'll get in. You have an exemplary school record and a fine educational background. You don't need me to tell them that it would be a crime to keep you out." "Yes, and how embarrassing will it be for all of us if I'm rejected? There are only 20 slots open, and I am both the youngest and the only female applicant." She did not mention that she would be only the 3rd female ever accepted under the intention of studying engineering, and the first one had already had a doctorate in physical sciences. "All you have to do is walk upstairs and talk to Professor Green. 1 sentence. My daughter is applying to the School of Engineering, and she is perfectly qualified." Her eyes closed briefly. He had to understand how important this was. "Please, Father." He nodded distractedly, but did not look up from his scribblings. Isabella watched him for a moment, then blew a breath out her nose and pushed off the desk. She was at the door before he spoke. "I spoke with him yesterday, Isabella. Just don't fail the placement exam." The young woman smiled, but pushed on through the door, leaving her father with his studies. She leaned back against the door. It wasn't that she hadn't expected her father to come through for her. It just meant a lot that he had remembered. She brushed the dampness from her eyes and stood briskly. The students from her father's class were gathered around the stone, scribbling desperately. The museum would not close, but the library would, and even those who knew absolutely nothing about how to accomplish their assignment had to know that the library was going to play an important part. Mark was leaning over the clump of students, squinting at the stone. He actually had the entire script copied down on the blackboard in his dormitory, with almost as many notes and theories as her father. He was a 3rd-year student at the university and was taking the class as a teacher's assistant. But of course, the wise Professor Reed insisted on even his teaching assistant doing all assignments. Not that it would be a hardship for Mark. Mark had at least a dozen possible translations for different phrases and sentences already copied out, many of which he had not shown to the professor yet. Isabella, though, was glad she was not in the class. She tried her best for both her father and Mark's sake, but she couldn't bring herself to be interested in the hunk of rock. She had been hearing about the damn 3-text stone for years now, and just did not care anymore. But Mark would be mesmerized for hours. Isabella should just go home, pick up a book, and leave both her father and her fiancé to their obsession. But Mark had made reservations at the club for dinner. They were going to have that meal, but she had no illusions that he would actually remember on his own. Someone would have to be there to drag him away. Having nothing better to do, Isabella wandered among the exhibits. Most of the things down here were mysteries, like the 3-text stone with its indecipherable scripts or relics with indiscernible purposes, so very few of the pieces of rock, clay, and metal had much of any information to read. There was often nothing more than a date and a site discovered on the exhibit label. It made for a quick circuit of the area. Less than half an hour later, Isabella was staring intently at an oddly twisted piece of metal. It actually had some information on the plaque next to it, one that said the pictograms on this relic matched some of the 3-text stone across the hall. But Isabella did not bother reading it. Her father had had the same office for more than 10 years, and she'd been staring at these relics while waiting for her father most of that time. She had actually met Mark right in this hall. She had been waiting for her father to finish his last meeting of the day, and Mark had been waiting to be her father's last meeting of the day. They had been talking for an hour before Isabella realized that Professor Reed had probably forgotten that Mark was waiting for him. This was her favorite exhibit in the museum. Not because the piece of twisted metal was exceptionally pretty, or because she had some great theory of what it was. In fact, she liked it because she had no idea what it could possibly have been used for, and unlike many of the pieces preserved in this area, Isabella did think it once had a use. It was too carefully sculpted with sharply yet elegantly curved brass tubes and gentle compressions that Isabella was sure were buttons. She could just see gears through the curve of the top layer of brass tubes, and something about it always reminded her of the innards of a music box. Isabella wanted to know what it did, but from what her father said, it didn't do anything. Dozens of experts, historians, and engineers had run a bevy of tests on the thing and couldn't get it to do anything. Isabella took a step closer to the brass mystery behind its protective glass, and her foot caught on something loose. She looked down. "Oh, Lord, I'm sorry." There was a man curled up at the foot of the pedestal. Isabella stepped back cautiously. How had she not noticed him? He was barely 2 feet away from the hem of her dress. It was dark, but it wasn't nearly that dark. It was plenty light to make out his rough, sun-bleached clothes, the beggar's bowl tucked loosely against his lap, and when he lifted his head, it was plenty light to make out the white strip of fabric covering his eyes. It was not uncommon for the poor to find quiet, out-of-the-way spots in the museum to rest or beg, but the security guards usually kept them from wandering too far down the museum or from staying more than a few hours. But this was no usual beggar. Yes, he was dressed in rags and was clearly blind, but even with the blindfold and the scars just visible around the cloth, he was young, and he was handsome. His long straight hair was an almost faded red, but it was neither dirty nor tangled. Even his ragged clothing looked and smelled clean. "I'm sorry," Isabella stammered again, but the blind man just tilted his head to one side and asked, "What for?" Isabella could feel herself blushing. Not that it mattered. The blind man could not see her. It was just, well, I didn't see you there. An odd half-smile quirked across his lips, but disappeared before Isabella could respond. He nodded. "I didn't particularly want to be seen." "But I almost stepped on, What are you doing here? You're not here to look at the exhibits." Isabella stopped suddenly, realizing what she had said. "Just waiting." The blind man neither seemed to notice or be offended by her slip. "Good day." He pushed himself to standing, and as he picked up his crutch, Isabella realized why he hadn't noticed her stepping on his pants. He was missing his right leg from the knee down. With surprising speed and dexterity for someone down a limb, he found the wall with his hand and walked away, up the gentle slope towards the surface and the museum exit. Isabella watched him, feeling strangely unsettled. She jumped when a hand landed on her shoulder. "Are you all right, Izzy?" Mark asked. Mark was the only person in the world to call her Izzy. In the beginning, she'd been annoyed by it. More recently, she found it endearing. She didn't say anything, but leaned into his hand, a tacit request for him to wrap his arm around her shoulder. He either didn't notice or was too embarrassed for such a public display of affection. He pulled away. "Did the blind man say something to upset you?" "No, it's just. Do you know him?" Mark shrugged awkwardly. "Not at all, but he is here a lot. He's been harmless enough that the security guards leave him alone, but if he's bothered you in any way, I'm sure they can keep him away." "Why haven't I seen him here before?" Mark shrugged again. "I don't know. He doesn't really draw much attention to himself." He cleared his throat, a trait that Isabella knew he had picked up from her father, which was disturbing in its own way, and changed the subject. "I believe that we have reservations for 5 tonight. I still need to change, so if we don't leave now, we will be late." Isabella nodded. She wouldn't have minded him going out as he was, but he would not be allowed in the club without the proper kind of jacket and tie, and they had been turned away at the door before when Mark showed up in a shirt smeared with ink from the wrist to the elbow. Mark offered her a polite arm, and she took it, and they began the long hike up through the museum halls. The only exit from the building was at the very top of the bluff, though some of the higher offices and museum halls still had balconies. The halls curved around the edge of the bluff, always sloping gently up, except for the short stairways at the end of each hall, taking them just high enough to pass over the halls below. Offices and classrooms were mostly set down a short flight of stairs from the halls, occupying the spot in the cliff between the lowest part of one hall and the highest part of the hall below. Almost every room in the entire complex was able to have giant windows, and the few inner rooms were relegated to the few professors who were too prone to seasickness to spend their days staring out at the waves. The afternoon sunlight hit Mark and Isabella like a wall when they passed the water line, though the gently lapping waves dulled the light every few seconds. Many of the students and professors avoided whatever level of the building was currently touching the tide mark. The shifting light gave the solid stone structure the illusion of swaying and made even some of the most hardy nauseous, but neither Mark nor Isabella minded. There was a large table on display in the middle of this level that was carved with a pictographic legend of a sinking island. It was one of Mark's favorite pieces, because around the rim there were some symbols that matched the top script on the 3 text stone. They were incredibly faded, and Mark had actually been the first one in recorded history to notice them. Any other day, when they were not already running late, he would have stopped to stare intently at them and point out small similarities to some other relic to Isabella. Today they walked by quickly, ignoring the gently lapping waves of light that alternately bathed the symbols in light and shadow. Isabella expected to pass the blind man on their way up. If nothing else, the flights of stairs should cause him some trouble and slow him down, but she did not see him. When they passed through the darkened arch at the top of the bluff, out into the unfiltered sunlight of the island air, Mark let go of her arm, squeezed her hand, and rushed off towards his dormitory across the grassy yard. Isabella veered off to the side. Separated from the sea by the front lobby of the museum and a small courtyard was the library. It was a huge structure, assembled from stone excavated when the original builders were emptying out what would eventually be the halls, offices, and classrooms of the museum below. Even before they stepped below the surface to be wowed by the miles of subterranean halls, architecture students were amazed by the immense library. In fact, a few of the modern architecture professors insisted that the structure should not be able to stand, not to mention ever remain standing for more than 600 years, and support the weight of more than 20 million books. It was too big, the glass windows took up too much of the supporting walls, and, most mysteriously of all, it was built with blocks that were too big for the builders to have hauled up from the halls below, not to mention stacked for a 4-story structure. The experts couldn't explain how the original architects had managed to install a 6-foot square section of clear glass floor in each level through the entire building, which was a real problem. The glass on the topmost floor had cracked 3 years ago in an unusually violent earthquake, and the architects could not figure out how to safely replace it. Isabella loved nothing more than strolling to the center of the first floor and staring up through the glass floors above her. She held that if the stuck-up architecture students and professors could not fix the problem, they should hand the project over to the School of Engineers. Professor Alberts and his students would be able to come up with a solution, but the petty politics of the university kept them from even trying. So the top layer was just roped off with danger signs and left to mar the beauty of the sweeping structure. The brass stairs and elevator were relatively new, replacing the wide wooden stairs that had rotted out years ago. After a moment of waiting, Isabella wandered into the stacks. Mark had probably gotten distracted by an idea that had just had to be written out on his blackboard before he left. Hopefully, he would not have dressed first. Isabella hated the rude looks the doorman gave them every time Mark showed up at the club covered in chalk dust. But either way, Mark would know where to find her when he was ready. She found the book she had been reading the last time she was here and found her place. The thick tome was mostly diagrams, almost all of them theoretical, about steam-powered engines and simple energy generators. From what a surprisingly knowledgeable librarian had told her, almost every machine and generator had been proven inoperable, imperfect, or just plain impossible, but that did not stop them from being fascinating. Isabella took the book over to one of the large windows, angling it so that the sunlight would illuminate the small details. The page showed a diagram of an air ventilation system. It was smaller and much more compact version of the one used to pump clean air down to the depths of the museum halls. The problem with it was the power source. The book showed a complicated energy generator made with magnets on a wheel, but that wouldn't provide enough energy to keep the forced air moving. Isabella leaned in closer. There had to be some way to substitute something for the simple turbine. She let the book hang loose in her hands, staring out into the yard for a moment, not really considering the problem, but imagining herself magically solving it. It took her a moment to realize what she was seeing before her. The blind man was in the yard, sitting against the central fountain. He had a cup held out in front of him, but made no attempt to actively beg. He had his face tilted up to the sun, and he was as still as a statue. While she watched, a student walked by and without even looking dropped a coin in the cup. The beggar said something, but the man did not stop or acknowledge him in any way. Maybe Isabella had done something similar dozens of times without even noticing the man. Isabella found herself retracing her footsteps, dropping the book back on its shelf almost as an afterthought. She slipped out of the stacks and through the tall glass doors, then stopped. He was still sitting there, face tilted up towards the sun. Why had she come out here? She had nothing to say to him, no money to give him, no reason to approach him. Izzy! Mark's voice saved her from having to figure out what she was doing, and she turned towards her fiancé happily. He was dressed for dinner, complete with chalk dust all over his jacket sleeve, and a very clear dust handprint on the back of his pants. "We're going to be late!" Isabella smiled. "Don't worry, we can catch a cab down the hill." "So who is the blind man?" Isabella had been listening to Mark talk about the three-text stone over dinner for almost an hour, and while she loved his enthusiasm and the fact that he was so willing to share it with her, she was ready for a change of subject, especially as they had been seated at one of the best, most isolated tables in the entire club. They were upstairs, on the balcony, looking down on the men playing billiards and cards below. Most of the room was exceptionally well lit, the gas lights reflected in brandy glasses, polished wood floors, and brass decorations on tables. But on the balcony, everything was dimmer, lit only by a few candles and the spillover from below. Mark smiled self-consciously. He knew that he'd been rambling on. "I don't really know, just a beggar." "But you said he was around quite often." Mark shrugged. "Yes, though not usually so late in the day. He's usually around during low tide." "What does tides have to do with it?" Mark shrugged again. "I don't know, but it does. As the tides shift, when he comes around shifts too. Maybe he doesn't like how dark it gets at high tide." Isabella laughed. "He's blind, Mark. I doubt he cares about the level of light." Mark blushed, but smiled broadly at her. "You may have a point." After a moment of just smiling at her, Mark remembered what they had been talking about. Yes, but he's been doing that for years. The security guards and all the students know him. I'm actually surprised you don't. That painting that Mattie Jones, the art student from the island of Tripoli, painted last year, was of him." Isabella nodded. The painting had hung in the lobby until it had sold just a month or two ago. It had been beautiful, a simple portrait of a man standing in the middle of the university courtyard with a hand out, as if to catch the sunlight, and his face tilted back as if staring into the sun. Maybe that's why he seemed so familiar. Of course, in the portrait, his face was not visible, and the artist had given him back his leg. But it was definitely the same man. Slight yet tall, long, straight, pale red hair. He was even wearing the same simple, sun-bleached clothes, though if her memory served her, they appeared to be new and slightly more stylish in the painting. Mark was watching her with a smile over the rim of his cup of coffee. "Why so curious? Are you thinking of taking up charity?" Isabella frowned. It's not that. I mean, he would probably be a good cause. It has to be hard to be both blind and crippled. But I don't know. I'm just curious. She smiled suddenly. And a little bored with talking about your work. Mark blushed and started stammering apologies, but stopped when he realized Isabella was laughing. We could talk about your work. His words were halfway between a tease and a real offer, but Isabella puffed out her cheeks and blew out a long breath. Anything but that. She took a sip of her own coffee. The last thing I want to talk about is my potentially disastrous application to the university. Mark snorted. Don't be silly. There is absolutely nothing potentially disastrous about your application. Even if your father wasn't the head of a department here, you would still be a prime candidate for one of the open slots. The designs you submitted as your application material were better than what a lot of the fourth-year students are presenting for their final thesis. Isabella frowned. They were not. She would admit that her simple engine worked, but it was a deeply flawed design. It lost more energy than it passed on, and she spent enough time examining the engineering students' final theses to know exactly what kind of work they were producing. Mark. He cut her off. No, Isabella, I guarantee that tomorrow you will be taking the placement exam with the other freshmen. And what if I fail the exams? What if I get into the university but the School of Engineering won't take me? Mark snorted. You know what? You're right. Let's not talk about your work.